Hello, Fred. Welcome. Patrick, welcome. If you're joining in right about now, this is Ron Coddington, editor and publisher of Military Images magazine, coming to you from Military Images headquarters here in Arlington, Virginia. I'm going to wait a minute or two, let folks join in so they can watch. See Ann and Buck, welcome. David, welcome. Got hopefully a good show. It's been a crazy and fun week, and looking forward to sharing that with everyone. Thank you for the applause, Fred. Hello, Dalton, Georgia. Nice to see everyone. Kyle, how are you doing? Nice to see you. Give it another minute or so. Michael, Carol Coddington, I recognize that name. Welcome to Military Images Live. Give it another minute or so. As you can see, we're starting off with one of my favorite moments of last week. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Let another minute or so go by and we'll get started up. Got more folks coming on. Thank you. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned earlier, this is Military Images Live. I'm Ron Coddington, the editor and publisher, where we're talking about interesting finds that have happened over the last week and answering your questions about Civil War photography, specifically portraits of soldiers and sailors. Welcome to everybody else coming on board. I see more names popping up on the screen. Anyway, I want to jump in and tell you about what I think is a historic moment that occurred last Wednesday about 10:30 a.m. If you were over at the National Archives in the Innovation Hub, you would have seen the public launch of Civil War Photo Sleuth, which was something that was founded by Kurt Luther. And for me, it was an especially memorable moment. About 3 years ago in 2015, Kurt began writing a column for Military Images called Photo Sleuth. One afternoon, I believe it was in the fall, Kurt came over to the house and we were sitting and talking, and he described to me a vision for a way that we could use data and we could use the crowd, we could use our fellow collectors to be able to leverage all that they know and the power of the internet and database technology to build on the foundation that many of us have worked on over the last 40 or 50 years and be able to identify soldiers using data, using big data, and using what most folks call crowdsourcing. So 3 years later, after that conversation in the Innovation Hub at the National Archives, a group of us watched as Kurt flipped a switch, and I've captured the moment here. Here is Kurt. You can see him right in the middle there with his hands up in the air. That was just after the moment that he made the switch. And by making a couple of commands, he turned turned Civil War Photo Sleuth into something that all of you could share. We had a number of great folks in attendance. We had representatives, of course, from the National Archives. It was their home base. We had the Library of Congress. We had Civil War Times was represented through Melissa Wynn and a bunch of other folks. So it was really a delightful day. This was last Wednesday, August 1st. So since then, many of you have participated, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. I had some back and forth with Kurt during the event and after, and he sent me an email and he said we received a flood of emails, mostly positive, lots of questions and lots of requests, which we both think is absolutely fantastic. That means all of you are beginning to use it, get a feel for it, and understand what all it can do. So we've got that going on. We also talked about the idea that the volume of changes is so big that we need to act as quickly as we can to begin addressing them. So, for example, one thing we've done, several of you talked about the idea of having the ability to identify a photo on Civil War photo sleuth, because you may have an identified photograph of a soldier or a sailor and would like to identify that person. So Kurt and his team have added that functionality. So my reason for giving you that illustration is simple. Civil War photo sleuth is only going to be as powerful and as positive experience as you can make it. Your feedback is absolutely critical. And most importantly, the work that you do to identify photographs, because in the end, this is a human operation. This is human intelligence that helps to make these IDs. So just going through Facebook, I found a bunch of uses, and I tried to capture them in this collage here. One of them I'm going to talk about specifically in a moment, but you can see that a lot of the posts on here are folks asking, is this the person? Is this possibly the individual that I see in my photograph? This is very natural. This is the way that we envision people using civilwarphotosleuth.com. You go in there, you find someone who the face recognition technology suggests is possibly the individual, and then you use other data that's available in the photograph. It could be a regiment that's identified. It could be the rank of the soldier. It could be the backdrop. Any and all of those criteria go into making a positive identification. And you can also reach out to the community that way. So what you see here in this collage is a group of mostly identifications in progress. Some of them in the end will turn out to be positive IDs, others won't. But as you all know from the work you do in trying to identify faces, this is part of the course. Sometimes you ID someone, sometimes it has to wait until another day. So, I want to talk about two positive IDs that were made by one individual. This is Dave Morin, and his interest is in New Hampshire soldiers. He's had a long interest in New Hampshire. And what you see in the background of this image in color is his Facebook post. And on either side are the black and white images are ones that he found through Civil War Photo Sleuth. Both of these images happen to be ones that are in our database. So when Dave went in to try to find them, he did not know who these individuals were, but they did have New Hampshire back marks, which was his interest area. So Dave ran these through and he was able to identify both of them. And the fact that he was able to make an identification adds so much to our knowledge. So I want to tell you a little bit about each of these soldiers that he identified. I'm going to start with this gentleman right here. He's on the left. His name is William Baldwin. He enlisted in January 1863 as a second lieutenant in the 1st New York Engineers. I did a little bit of research to find out more about William Baldwin and found out that he was in a number of engagements. Just 6 months after he was commissioned, he was in South Carolina at Fort Wagner, Morris Island, and the Siege of Charleston. Later on, he went to participate in the Siege of Petersburg. He survived the war and mustered out in May of 1865 with his captain's bars, and he lived until 1917. The gentleman over here is Captain Edwin Green. He was the son of a farmer born in Pittsfield, New Hampshire. He was a student at Dartmouth when he left in 1862 to enlist in the Army. He started out as a sergeant major of the 9th New Hampshire Infantry, and he ended the war as a captain. He was at the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864, which the anniversary was about a week ago. He survived that with a gunshot wound. Although he did have a gunshot wound to the shoulder, he survived the battle and he survived the war. And in 1865, Dartmouth gave him a degree. He went on to become a lawyer, a journalist. He lived in Chicago. He lived in Iowa. He lived in South Dakota. He rose to become the state's attorney of South Dakota, and he died in 1900 in Yankton, South Dakota. So you may be wondering, why do we want to identify these faces? Why is this so important to us? Why is it so important to Kurt Luther that he invested 3 years and considerable resources to put together CivilWarPhotosleuth.com? Well, we may all have our reasons to identify soldiers. Kurt does it because he wants to put names to the faces. He wants us to help us remember history. And I feel very much that same way. It's one thing to see the face of a soldier, but it's quite another to find out who he is. And once you know who he is, you have a piece of our history that's really, really important. Now, one of my favorite quotes is this one. It's by a British historian, essayist, Thomas Carlyle. In 1830, his essay on history, he says, "History is the essence of innumerable biographies." I love that phrase because I think it touches very much of what we do. If you know the stories of these individuals, folks like Captain Green and Lieutenant Baldwin, you'll get a sense of who we are, what our history was all about. Now, here's another version of Carlyle's quote. This is one that I give credit to him. This is one that I made up and one that I talk about when I'm doing talks and elsewhere. And it's simply this: the history of the Civil War is the stories of its soldiers and sailors. I believe that. It's what motivates me. It may motivate you. You may have other motivations, but this is what really gets me. Now, here's another longer quote. This was made by the 16th President of the United States, November 10th, 1864, after he won election to a second term. Those of you who know history know that Abraham Lincoln, in the summer of 1864, wasn't quite sure that he was going to be coming back to the White House for a second term. There's a stalemate in front of Atlanta, a stalemate in Virginia, lots of troubles at home, a lot of war weariness. When he won, he made this quote in a serenade to folks who wanted him to make a speech. He said, "Human nature will not change in any future great national trial compared with the men of this. We shall have as weak and as strong, as silly and as wise, as bad and as good. Let us therefore study the incidents in this as philosophy, to learn wisdom from, and none of them as wrongs to be avenged." That's Abraham Lincoln. I think he's talking about the importance of the innumerable biographies that Thomas Carlyle discussed way back in his essay 35 years before Lincoln made these comments. So, let's move on. Wednesday, that was Civil War Photo Sleuth launch day, was followed for me by a trip to Tennessee to meet with a collector. It was an interesting collection to look at because it included the most images of Lookout Mountain that I've ever seen in one place. If you're like me, I don't know what it is. The that iconic outcropping of rock that towers over the valley, is visible in the valley where Chattanooga is. It's really quite impressive. This image here is part of that collection, one of many images. This is an oft-reproduced image. It's the 8th Kentucky Cavalry, 8th Kentucky Infantry, U.S. Specifically, this is the color guard Captain John Wilson is up front there with the flag. You can see the men behind him that carried that flag up to the top of Lookout Mountain on that fateful day when Hooker and the other Burnside and the other generals, led by Major General Ulysses S. Grant, broke the siege. Chattanooga broke out of Chattanooga. So this is a great image. There's some pencil inscription up there. The dear old flag on top of Lookout Mountain after Hooker's battle above the clouds. You can see that in pencil up here. Down the bottom, mentioning Captain Wilson, his men proud from the Iron Brigade. So you've got a really wonderful photo. As I mentioned, it was one of many images that I saw. Someone that you have to know is this man. Here he is. Probably not recognizable to most of you. This is Robert M. Lynn. He made Lookout Mountain the icon. In some ways, made it the icon as it is. He was a photographer, he was an entrepreneur. He saw the value of Lookout Mountain as a base of operations, as a gallery. He worked that gallery for, I think, up until he and his family up until the 1930s. You all can correct me on that. I haven't finished all the research yet, but worked a long, long time, many decades. Most of that time photographing soldiers, later on after the war, photographing tourists that came to town to see all the sights and visit the battlefield. So a lot of great images. I want to share with you just a few more of the scans that I made while I was there. Here's one I think is absolutely fantastic. Got a group of Union soldiers. They brought along their lunch. You can see tin cups. You can see hardtack. One gentleman in the foreground, or closest to us, is holding a fork with what appears to be a piece of salt pork or something on it. Everybody's getting into the action. They're having something of a staged picnic on top of that rock. In the background, you can see the valley. There's another one. It's an Ohio regiment that posed on top of Lookout Mountain. These are three probably ambrotypes or tintypes when they're originally made. They're carried back home to Cleveland, Ohio. And I know that because there's photographers' advertisement across the bottom telling us it's from a gallery in Cleveland. So once these images made it back home to Ohio, the photographer in Cleveland made carte de visite copies of them, probably so these men could share them with their comrades and share them with their family and other folks who are interested. So you've got a great image. You've got, I don't know how many, got the color bearer over here. I'm covering them up. You got the color bearer standing alone. It's like a group of staff officers in the center, and then everybody, maybe all the staff is in that last image there. A lot of guys in that last image. If you think that's a lot, whoa, you've got all these guys here. Members of a company. Now this is an albumen. This is a big photo. And it's one of a couple of images of various companies from a regiment. This one is interesting, not only because of the number of soldiers that are on top, but if you look closely, and you may not be able to see it where you are right now, each of these men have a small number in pencil above their head and all around the side of the photograph in pencil on the mount is written all of their names. So a little bit of research should be done on this one, but quite interesting to find out who these soldiers were and why were they there. Were they there because they fought in the battle? Were they there because they were visiting after the battle was over? Don't know yet, but we're going to find that out. And just so you think that it wasn't just soldiers alone that were up there, got this image. last one I'm going to share with you. There you go. Guys brought their horses up. There you got 3 officers. The gentleman in the middle is identified. We're going to get some more information for you about him. He appears in a couple of images, but still a popular destination, not only for soldiers, but also for horses, apparently. So look forward to that. What we're doing, I should mention this, the next issue of Military Images, which will be coming out in September, will include the first of a 3-part installment about Lookout Mountain. The first segment will be about the Lynn family, how they came to be on Lookout Mountain, and how Lookout Mountain became important. We'll take a look at some of those early images. And then in the second installment, we're going to take a look at some of the classic images of Lookout Mountain. These horsemen, for example, will be there. And we'll look at others, not only from this collector, but we've had a number of images that have been submitted by you. So we're going to be including some of those as well. That will be in the winter issue. And then in the spring issue, we're going to have the concluding 3rd part of the installment, where we'll look at Chattanooga Military Park after the war, later on in the war, when it was used for other purposes. So stay tuned for that. Next up, one of the other galleries that we're working, and we put out a call to action a couple of issues ago, were for cigar smokers and pipe smokers. As you may know, there's quite a history in the Union and Confederate armies with pipe and cigar smokers. And we wanted to take a look at that through the portrait photographs that have survived. And we put out a call to action to find out who had them and what they had. And what we found was a tremendous number of photographs. I want to say a big thanks to everyone who subscribes and those who follow us on Facebook for submitting your images. In fact, we had so many images that the original idea of having a single gallery dedicated to cigar and pipe smokers became 2 galleries. The first one will run in the next issue, and it will be dedicated to cigar smokers. And then we'll do pipe smokers in the winter issue. That, I think, gives us an opportunity to put together a really nice grouping and show some variation on the various themes. So I thought I would show just a couple of the submissions that we had this evening. This image is unbelievably pristine. It's from Dennis Graska, his collection. Dennis, if you're listening, watching, thank you very much. Absolutely wonderful. Got 2 gentlemen in civilian clothes. One guy has got a gray cap on, and I don't know that you can see it quite so well here, but in one of the classic maneuvers by photographers, they would often tint the tips of the cigar with red, and that is, in fact, exactly what is happening here. So really a great photograph, perhaps taken early in the war, before the gentleman on the left had his uniform issued to him, or it could have been taken after the war, maybe as a last chance to get together with a comrade at the war's end. So great photograph. Here's another one that I wanted to share. This comes from the DL Daily collection. Thank you very much, DL, for submitting this photo. You got 3 guys. They've all got stogies, 2 in hand. 1 is in his mouth. Interesting detail on the back. If you can see up here, I don't know if you can read it, but it says, please accept this as a token of our love toward you, dear Ella. Now, who Ella is, we don't know. Was all 3 of these soldiers sending this image to Ella? We don't know. Love to find out more about who these guys are. Maybe Civil War photo sleuths can help us out in that. So One more I want to show you from the Carl Sundstrom collection. It's got some great images of cigar smokers. Pretty rare when you see folks who are just sort of lounging around, and here you've got just one such image. Got a soldier, he's an officer, he has his coat hanging up on what appears to be a hook. His cap is on the table next to him, he's resting his arm on the table. He's got his legs crossed. He's got his, you can see his square tipped boots propped up on the end. And of course, you've got pretty big stars and stripes hanging on the wall behind him. He's enjoying a good smoke. Another one that I like to run through Civil War Photo Sleuth and find out what his story is if we can track him down. So you can look forward to the cigar gallery. That's just a little bit of a preview of what's coming up. And again, big thanks to the community of collectors for being so generous and sharing from your collections. So got one more item tonight that I want to share with you. This is some feedback from an image I talked about last week. You all may remember this. All right, here we go. This is the soldier who's posed in a really unique camp backdrop. You've got some sort of crude wood boards. He's in a case. He's got some identification information, but it's incomplete. Some of the feedback that we got about this was really talking about the boards. Something I had said pointed out that because the boards were so crude, and I'm not sure you can see it well from here, but they're pretty crude planks, which suggested to me that they might have been laid down by a photographer who had traveled to camp to set up a tent, sort of a makeshift studio to photograph soldiers. Feedback we got about this was, you know what, it's very possible that this happened not in a camp studio at all, that it actually happened in the hometown of this individual or happened in some local studio. The detail that I learned was in some of these old buildings, as you went up into the second and the third stories, sometimes they would use coarser wood rather than a more finished flooring. So it's very possible that, in fact, these aren't crude boards that were laid down by a photographer inside of a camp tent. They're actually real wood floor that was on an upper floor of a building or a warehouse that a photographer was renting or using somehow as a studio. So I thought that was an interesting detail. And for me, it's the kind of information that keeps collecting photographs lively because it helps bring out new information to help get a better understanding of these soldiers. It gives us a better understanding of some of the theories that are out there. In this case, I learned a lot about construction of homes and buildings from the 19th century. Now, we haven't tried to prove any of this and check into it. At this point, it's an interesting theory, and it's probably just as strong as the camp photography theory. But these are the kind of little details that keeps all of us going, keeps me thinking about what we do and how we do it. So on that note, I want to thank you all very much for paying attention and for tuning in this evening. I'm going to use our new Military Images closing motto, keep showcasing, interpreting, and preserving. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great night. Bye-bye.